everybody. A warm welcome to the fifth episode of our podcast series, Everyday Decoloniality, a multicultural initiative. And today we have with us Ritodhi Chakraborty, who is a father scholar activist with an interdisciplinary grounding in environmental science, politics, and geography. For the past decade, he has worked with various think tanks, rural communities, and civil society institutions in the United States, India, Bhutan, Brazil, and China on issues of livelihoods, natural farming, farmer cooperatives, migration, youth, masculinity, climate change, and traditional knowledge. And today we are going to engage a conversation on ecological subterfuge in humanity versus nature. So, a very warm welcome, Ritodhi.
Thank you, Sharon.
So Ritodhi, to start with the first question, what I was really wondering is, while reading about the Amazon forest fire, then melting glaciers in the Arctic and the Antarctic, drying river basins in India, severe water scarcity as we find examples, for instance, in South Africa, and many more such kind of challenges on the one side. And then on the other side, what we see is a whole lot of conferences, workshops, discussion forums, articles, research chapters, classroom teachings, solidarity marches, documentaries, hashtags, memes, etc. towards developing, consciousness on the other. Now, this cycle, what I really understand is it is a kind of cycle of systematic patterns of destruction and sympathetic strategies of recovery, and which has been going on for a long time. And also in which some agencies are common on both the sides. So now, as a conservative practitioner, what do you think that in spite of so many engagements and awareness initiatives, where our problem lies? Practically, why does the environmental issue still remain unresolved? In fact, what we are seeing is that is a kind of opposite thing, that the problems are aggravating day by day. Why is it happening in such a manner?
So thank you for that question, Shayan. And I know this is actually a question that is often discussed, as you said, in many different forums by many different people. But first, I would like to make a few, I would say, changes in the question itself that you asked me. First of all, this word conservation itself has deeply colonial roots, right? It comes out of an idea of protectionism, of bounding resources, which then can be extracted and used for the purposes of a certain group of people. Whoever that group is completely dependent on the hierarchy of power that exists at that point of time in that location, right? That's one. So I would kind of change that and say, as a scholar working with environment development debates, right? Because often the question is not about conservation. The question is about questions are about justice. The questions are about autonomy. The question is about the transformation, let's say, of a resource, if you want to think of it in those terms, right? And there's just so many places to start from to address something like this. However, let me start with something very basic, right? One of the things that we always push back against, sort of, let's say, rooted in this idea of the epistemologies of the South and these ideas of non-binary ways of looking at the world, which are part of the cosmologies of most, communities around the world that I have worked with, where you don't have this Cartesian binary between humans and nature, right? And part of the problem is that, right? So I would call that the problem of framing. So often, let's say you have climate activists or you have environmental activists, and they position themselves as such. And there's that line of that song from it's a silly movie, but the song is really nice, called Sadda Haq. And there's that line from that song which it says, "O eco-friendly nature ke rakshak, hai bhi hu nature."
Yes.
And so it's sort of making that point, right? That in the ex-colonial world, right? Let's say we take that space for just now. Often that distinction has been made, even in terms of activism, of thinking of the environment as somehow being separate from human society. And we see this differentiation politically, where you have green parties versus, let's say, labor parties. You see it in a very big way in science, right? So you see like sort of like a kind of a demarcation of territories of discipline, right? This is what environmentalists study. This is what anthropologists study, and so in that sense. There is this, kind of almost a betrayal of of how the relationships exist, or the relationships that are emergent in this world, right? And so thinking of, and so in that sense, I would hold colonial science I would sort of almost, keep colonial science in that. I would say court. I would drag colonial science to court and ask colonial science them that question. Environmentalism itself, the roots of environmentalism are from such ideas about land governance, about land use, about dispossession. I mean, the first national parks in the United States were created by evicting Native Americans from those spaces, right? I mean, the giant parks in California were made by throwing people out.
Right.
And so part of the problem is this framing of colonial science, which even today is ascendant, right? Even an organization like big universities, intergovernmental organizations, whatever you may think of them, because of the way that they frame these questions, and because they sort of kind of worship at the altar of positivism in a way, which then is sort of kept alive by generations of investment in converting, let's say, non-quantifiable human-nature relationships into numbers, right? So you have something like colonial science sort of driving this agenda of environmentalism, and it's itself from this agenda emerged things like this obsession with population, right? This idea about this demographic collapse, this things like Thomas Malthus, which then drives, I would say, a century of environmental science. And even today, if you talk with people, they keep bringing up this idea of population, which in itself is rooted those imaginaries and those ideologies and in that politics of domination, of sort of finding a way to shift the blame onto communities and spaces that actually are the ones getting exploited. And so, so that is sort of point one, right? Colonial science and the way we even frame these ideas, right?
Right.
The second problem is sort of this lack of structural solutions, right? So what does that mean? Like, for example, currently this obsession with, for example, this carbon obsession, right? That today Norway, which has one of the biggest per capita incomes in the world, it's like, probably the world's one of the top 5 oil producers. Their method for dealing with, I would say, their sinful livelihood practices is by buying giant tracts of forest in Brazil, in Indonesia, wherever it is, and then turning it into carbon credits, right? And so this is, in a way, I mean, this is this kind of environmentalism. You could call it like eco-modernism, where it's sort of like the solutions are all technical, right? Oh, we need to solve let's say, the climate crisis. And then what is the problem? There's too much CO2, right? The problem is not that there is an unreasonable dependence on fossil fuels in the developed world, right? Or in a certain class of society. The problem is that there's too much CO2 in the... So you see, like, there is this movement of focus from what we should be looking at to something else for which there is already a solution in place. So this is part of that problem of environmentalism, again, is that they can only identify problems for which they already have the tools. So they're not identifying problems that are a lot more complicated than what they give it legitimacy for. Which is why you see, like, I'm sitting here in New Zealand and like 20 kilometers from Christchurch, where the Christchurch shooter shot up the mosque, right? And in his like many page long manifesto, one of the things he talked about was overpopulation. He actually said as an environmentalist and that he was doing this for the planet. And so there is also a lot of, I would say, First Nation scholars and feminist scholars and scholars from the global South are rising up and sort of saying that environmentalism has very strong and deep roots to fascism and to racism and to sexism. And so environmental field itself is compromised because of where it has, where it is rooted. And so the second point is that there is a complete lack of structural solutions, right? If today I have a problem, let's say in the Himalayas with, biodiverse oak forests declining, the solution is not to replant those spaces with pine trees, but that's what's happening, right? And the reason that's happening is that there is this mechanism of colonial forestry, which is now, I would say, in cahoots with this idea of urban forestry, right? And pine trees grow fast, which means there is a fast turnover rate, which means then you can harvest the carbon faster. And so, throwing market-based solutions at problems of environmental justice, at problems of lack of autonomy over resources inherently does nothing, right? In some ways, it actually is another industry. The environmental industry is actually a massive industry. And so there is, and then there's the third point, right? These two are the first two. And the third point is sort of, right, that alternatives are marginalized, right? I mean, I'll give you an example. Where I did a lot of my work in Uttarakhand, a very famous movement is the Chipko movement, right? And everybody talks about the Chipko movement and the fact that women and villagers were hugging trees to stop, the government or / private logging companies from cutting them down. And one of the narratives that emerges is that they were doing this for nature, right? Whatever that word means, nature. I'm really not sure what that means. But I spent a lot of time in those villages where the Chipko movement happened in Uttarakhand. And when you talk to some of the women that were very young when it was happening and are now, I would say, in their 40s, 50s, and some of the original people who were part of the movement are still alive, and you start realizing that it was really a movement of autonomy, right? It wasn't that the villagers were saying that these forests are sacred to us, we have to protect it for some inherently, I would almost call it like Western notion of environmentalism, like for nature. They were saying something they were saying these are our forests. This control should remain within the community. How we want to use these forests should be up to us to decide, not up to the government, not up to a private company. So, deep down, it was a movement about resources, a movement about autonomy, a movement about true sustainability and thinking about the future. Because these villagers realized that if these forests were cut down, their watersheds would dry up, their livestock would die, they wouldn't have any way of maintaining any kind of financial, economic, or cultural sovereignty. And so the reason that that movement even took place was because people were fighting for their rights to live with dignity, right? However, the relationships between humans and nature, if there is such a demarcation, that have been talked about in terms of even this event, has been completely, I would say, hijacked by the environmental movement in presenting these people as some kind of noble savagery, right? Oh, they live among nature, and that's why they understand nature, and so they were protectors of nature. So, this kind of brings me to that idea of this alternatives, right? There is an alternative idea of growth, of development, of being, of well-being, which is constantly marginalized within these colonial science projects of resource control that then create the categories both of nature and of humans, right? And so it's almost like, let's say you go to a country like Brazil or you go to a country like India, it's almost like the indigenous people have to perform within their box of indigeneity, right? So it's like, I have given you this box, you have to sort of stay within this box and act the way that an indigenous person should act, right? So essentially, one of the biggest problems, again, with environmentalism is that it has this obsession with system science, it has this obsession with financialization of solutions, of scaling up, of forgetting that much of the best and I would say most effective work happens at not the federal scale, often is decentralized. And so there is that notion of, the state as the fundamental entity of doing any kind of what they call it environmental conservation, or which I would call natural resource control, right? And so these are, I would say the issues with environmentalism are the issues with development, right? Like essentially what we're talking about is there are many, many worldviews, there are many, many worlds in this world, right? It's kind of like the pluriverse idea. And, trying to control that narrative by saying that this is fortress conservation, right? It's like this African savanna where white people come and stare at wildebeest or, giraffes. Or they go, to the Himalayas and they sort of are in this rarefied landscape where apparently everything is pure and the people are simple. And so there are these pure categories created by, certain ideas of state building, ideas of commercialization, ideas of well-being, which are completely sort of in many ways hijacking as well as, completely disrupting any processes that we may or may not have for ensuring that, whatever relationships we have, whatever assemblages we have, right? And that's why it's kind of like thinking of it in terms of socio-natural objects, right? We are not man or nature, and that's why, theories like, ANT or even ideas coming out of the global south, actually, I would stress that much more again, where people are imagining in cosmologies, in ontologies that are a lot more non-binary, which are a lot more realistic. And so, I would say these are the three big things, sort of like the framing through colonial science, this lack of structural solutions and kind of like alternatives being marginalized, which is like that idea of agency, right? The agency of many of these people, many of these communities, which are not mainstream and that are often undermined both by the state and by big corporations.
Right. Right. Yes. I mean, while I was listening, thanks for this, very detailed outlining of the problems that you have come across, I believe, through your various engagements and experiences, and which you were also sharing. So I was wondering that with the challenges of eco-modernism that you were talking about, the kind of commercialization of nature under the mask of conservationist activities that take place, and then how the local communities, especially with your experience in Uttarakhand, you were talking about how the local communities, especially with the example of Chipko movement, that how they are trying to through the preservation and the protection of nature, how they're trying to think about the future, and how they're also trying to talk about an alternative version of development which is disentangled from the colonial parameters of science and technology. So with respect to this particular aspect, I was wondering to ask you that you work with very close to the Himalayas. You work with various nature's preservation activities associated with the Himalayas. So can you in detail share some of your activities with you are engaged with, the kind of experiences that you undergo, and the various ways that you along with your team of workers try to encounter these challenges that which you have outlined in your previous answer?
Yeah, no, that would be, yeah, I can definitely speak to that. And I would say, so I've worked in Bhutan, I've worked in India, and I've worked in China, and in Yunnan, which is, the southwestern part of China, which is quite mountainous. And so each of those spaces, right, I've had a very different sort of encounter with many of these activities, right? Of course, I won't go into detail too much because there's so much to say, but I'll talk about a few things which some of the, I would say, overarching themes that have emerged, in my own work as well. So first off, what I want to say is that, I started working in Uttarakhand and in Himachal almost a decade ago. And when I started, I had just finished a master's in environmental policy in Washington, D.C., and I had come back. And, like many Indians of my generation and of my class, I would say I grew up, lower middle class. I had no clue about India, what it was, like how it was organized, how things functioned. I knew really nothing. And so I would say part of what was driving me was that I had always really enjoyed and liked working, in the outside world, in the natural world, and then I really couldn't imagine working in a city. And also, I had studied environmental science and I'd studied environmental politics, and so I went to work for a few different NGOs, that were doing work around ideas of, I would say, agricultural preservation, agricultural autonomy, and giving sort of rights and seeds and all those things back to farmers. And when I first started this work, I myself was a deeply colonized subject. I mean, I still am. But back then, I wasn't very reflexive at all, right? And so I would often let's say, as a part of these NGOs, I would often go and speak with these communities in Uttarakhand or in Himachal or wherever, and come across as incredibly colonial, right? Sort of have that agenda inside my head that I'm the expert and these people are farmers, and I'm going to teach them how to, how to be free, which was an incredibly sort of, I would say, incredibly, in many ways, exploitative as well as completely demeaning situation, right? And in many ways, it was like I had to spend a lot of time unlearning, the issues that were major in rural India, in rural Himalaya, and part of it was actually kind of critiquing the institutions itself that I was a part of, which then led to me kind of leaving them and then striking off on my own, and then spending a lot of time in agrarian communities in the Himalaya without an agenda, right? I was there essentially to learn how to farm. I was essentially there living off savings that I had when I was in grad school and trying to, essentially trying to unlearn, right? To re-educate myself in some of the major structural issues that were at play in much of agrarian India. And so, um, uh, so, so what I also wanted to say is that, so in some ways, my whole engagement with the Himalaya or with where I work has gone through its own evolution, right? Has gone through its own sort of coming of age story. So I started out as this person who was incredibly arrogant, who thought that he knew everything about everything, and then I had this great like a real kind of moment of reckoning where communities really showed me that I was kind of an ignorant fool, like I knew nothing of nothing. And so it took me years. Like I spent 4 or 5 years in the Himalaya, in China, in Bhutan, and in India. Like for example, in China, a lot of the issues surrounded the fact that the state had wiped out a lot of non-industrial scientific, non-industrial knowledge systems, right? And so often I would, see farmers being sort of completely at a loss for alternatives because they had nothing else to fall back on. While on the other hand, in Uttarakhand and Himachal, I saw farmers sort of standing up against big seed companies or against big pesticide companies, but then kind of being, I would say, sort of be kind of betrayed by changes in, I would say wholesale pricing or changes in like transportation policies. And then in Bhutan, it was a lot more about sort of seeing how deeply the government was involved in every aspect of agrarian and rural life. And so in each space, right, there was a different set of challenges that these communities were dealing with, right? And so the first part of, I would say, my journey consisted of literally just working on a farm. So learning everything from scratch, how to milk cows, how to plow land, how to plant, how to irrigate, how to, control pests with in biological ways. And not just that, but kind of understand the rhythms of rural life in a way that, like at each season, there's a different set of activities that are performed, and the relationships, right, that are kind of like the bridges holding these societies together, that even despite, incredible exploitative tendencies of the state or of corporations, these communities are standing up and are like bracing against the onslaught day in and day out. And so the first, and again, I in no way am I under any kind of I would say misrecognition of the fact that I had tremendous privilege. Even when I lived with these communities, I always had the option of leaving, which they never had. And I had, education, and I spoke a certain language. All those things played a big part. And it was not that, it wasn't like that kind of thing that, European, which I saw Europeans doing in the Himalayas, right? They had come to experience poverty, or they had come to kind of, find themselves. I was doing none of those, right? I had actually honestly come to learn how I could support, people. That's what, because in the beginning I thought that my technical learning was enough, but then I realized that it was actually, grossly inadequate. And so, I would say the second part of my journey in the Himalayas was around finding ways of operationalizing the spaces where I saw I could make interventions as an outsider, right? As someone with a lot of privilege. And so what I quickly realized is that youth and young people were deeply marginalized in a lot of narratives coming out of the Himalayas, right? Because this is sort of a this is sort of a set of research all over the world that research as well as development and funding, or conservation funding or whatever, is that the urban spaces are thought of as young spaces, and then rural spaces are thought of as old spaces. And so, I would read these, I would be a part of these big sort of groups of, women's self-help groups, or one panchayats, or, like water panchayats and stuff. And it was all just old men often. And so I was really kind of surprised at the complete lack of, young people present there. And so I started to ask and be a part of then a lot of young people's lives, just kind of asking them what they want, what they do, who they are, how they think that these spaces should be. And so I ended up actually doing my dissertation on young men. And because there is this, very strong narrative in the Himalayas that, there's a lot of migration and the feminization of agriculture. And actually what I was seeing in the Himalayas was that, especially in Uttarakhand, that young men were going to these cities and getting just chewed up, right? Like with messed up industrial jobs, which were like exploiting them to the max. They were like getting their organs harvested, they were getting trafficked, they were getting beaten up, they were getting murdered. And so they just decided, many of them were sort of deciding that this wasn't it. Like they were just coming back home, and however, at home there wasn't anything to do either. And so what I started seeing was that there was this sort of rise of precarious labor, right? This kind of what in Uttarakhand they call it thekedari, right? It's sort of like this project-based labor. So there would be a canteen run by, let's say, a government organization somewhere in Dehradun, and then some older Pahari man would then hire a team of young Pahari guys who would then work there. But then a situation like this was completely different from their fathers' lives, where the fathers were tied to the land, or if they had a job, it was like a job that they kept till they died. But these young people sort of moved and loved that flexibility that the job, like a job like this, was giving them, right? And so then I became very interested in understanding how these kind of relationships were also transforming the socio-natural relationships that were at play in those villages itself, right? And so it could be something as simple as the fact that because of climate change in the Western Himalayas, there is a lot less snowfall, which is why for example, because if you don't get a lot of snow in the winter, then a lot of the pests don't die, which then end up affecting your spring crop, right? And so there is sort of a change in the kind of cropping that people are doing, yeah. And as you see, as I was traveling more and more with these young people, I sort of realized that they were brilliant in terms of understanding how to operationalize on these changes, on these transformations that were happening. And so I would say, like, the second phase of the work that I did was essentially understanding how I would often say marginalized people engage with modernity. So it's not so much that, we should throw out colonial science completely, or this or that. Whatever those decisions are cannot be taken by you and me, right? I mean, how, a 19-year-old from, a village at 3,000 meters in Uttarakhand wants to engage with the tools and the sort of materializations of modernity is up to him and up to, what he wants to do. And so what I kept seeing was there was a lot of judgment, and there was a lot of, I would say, lack of choices in terms of ideology given to some of these young people, right? They would say, they came and they said that, if you want to work for this environmental NGO, then you have to go and find all these farmers and, stop them from, shooting wild animals illegally. And then this guy would later say, what if you don't do this, if you don't, shoot these animals, then we can't really afford meat. We can't really, and this is not that we are hunting like 500 animals, right? It's something that we do once in a while. However, right, like if my father gets killed by a leopard, it'll take me 5 years to get compensation for his death. But if I kill a leopard, I'm going to be in jail the next day. And so, sort of, understanding that the state itself had created, in a way, imaginaries around how humans and non-humans should relate to each other, and also how humans and non-humans matter within the overall overall, I would say, vision of nation building, right? And so, like for example, I worked with in a lot of villages where there were active man-eaters, which was like a very common thing. And you would sort of come down to Delhi, which was what, 9 hours away, and you would talk to someone and they would say, "What, man-eaters? You mean like Jim Corbett?" I'm like, "No, like last week someone's kid got eaten." And so there was that complete sort of cleavage, right, between these worlds that I felt, which is sort of the third point, right? The second thing is this me trying to understand how these people are engaging with modernity. And then the third thing was me sort of encountering with, whoever I worked with, was some of these, I would say, urban slash class-based slash very neoliberal, very financialized ideas of nature protection, right? Where a tiger's or a leopard's life is worth more than a human's life. And so, I would say that was like the third stage where I sort of wanted to kind of be in a position where, support initiatives around allowing young people in the mountains to imagine futures which they often have not been allowed to. And so, like I talked a lot about the men, but also around the women. For example, there's this obsession with development planning to portray women as being like eco-feminists, being tied to the land and protectors and all this stuff, which is all great. Most of what I've learned about culture, I have learned from mounted women, but again, the point becomes maybe they should be allowed to speak for themselves, right? Instead of you or me putting a kind of a caricature or like a certain stereotype on how they're supposed to act. And so one of the stories which I tell a lot and I write about as well is sort of like this father-in-law, a daughter-in-law livestock complex, right? So there is this obsession among development interventions to provide livestock to families because they see livestock as being kind of like the central aspect of farming in the mountains. But because of how the hierarchy in the household is and how the power relations are, it is often the women of the household and often the daughter-in-law whose duty it becomes to now take care of the livestock. So the daughter-in-law now is responsible for raising the children, teaching them all those things that modern children need to know. She is responsible for taking care of the livestock. She is responsible for the house and the field and everything. And so what has happened is that, in the last generation, I would say the way that Pahari or Uttarakhand society was constructed is a lot of these women were not educated or allowed to go to school. However, that's not the case now. Most young women now are literate and can read and have been to school. And so they are sort of pushing back in incredible ways against the father-in-law, right? Because the men are often not there. They are working in mobile jobs, they're in the city, they're working for those tekedas. And so there is this sense that, like one woman said to me that these buffaloes are like my prison, right? So it's sort of like, livestock sort of imprisoning what people want to do, right, with their land or with their animals. And so then comes the question, like, what it is then that they want. And, they want a whole bunch of different things, right? Like, for example, one of the girls was like, I want my father-in-law to invest in a hand tiller, right, which is this small tractor that you can push with your hand. Because traditionally, patriarchy is so strong in the mountains that, women are not allowed to, plow the fields. However, there are no patriarchal rules about a hand tiller. So a woman can actually use the hand. And so what I mean is that there are so many different sort of arrangements happening around how to relate to the natural world, right? That could be from changing how people farm, that could be from changing relationships with predators or changing ideas around climate. And I write about that as well, like this idea that now we've entered a Kali Yuga, which is why the climate itself, is undependable, and there's hailstorms when there shouldn't be, and so there's a lot over there, right? Which, I mean, again, it's something that I can't get into now because there's so many different experiences. But what I'm trying to say is that there is a real marginalization of these plural narratives of relating to non-human objects and non-human subjects and non-human spaces, whatever you want to call them. And part of my work has been sort of support some of these narratives in a way that allows them to, fulfill whatever it is that they want to do.
Right. I mean, thank you so much for sharing your experiences. And as I was wondering that when you were talking about your experiences in the Himalayas from various dimensions and how you, when you came and started interacting with the people there and started working with them, you realized that how deeply colonized you were, how a deeply colonized subject you were, that you came with such a kind of the typical colonial arrogance, the typical colonial epistemic and ontological arrogance, and then you realize that it's that you have a lot to learn and as well as unlearn prior to that. So, if I just shift to the final question from this very aspect of your experiences with working with the local communities, I was wondering that. During your activities, as you said, you have met so many local communities, you interacted with them. And in the process of interaction, you must be undergoing varieties of socio-cultural experiences, especially that are closely related to environment, to nature. So, what impact, if you can briefly share that, what impact these experiences, have on your activities that you're engaged with?
Right, no, that's a great question. And I feel like it's one that is very difficult to answer also in a way because, again, like I was telling you from the beginning, right, like the natural world is really all of it, right? There is no differentiation, right? And, however, for me, what has been really incredible and in many ways very transformative has been to look at processes and situations from multiple vantage points, based on the positionality of the person or of the community that I was with. So, like one of probably the greatest experiences of my life happened in Yunnan. And I remember we were working over the Mekong in this little area of Yunnan called Lanshan. And there was this really, I would say, financially impoverished community of farmers. They were growing corn and, they were growing tea. And it was really, like, Yunnan is really sort of far from Beijing, right? It's just 2 hours from Kolkata. It's much closer to Myanmar than it is to Han China in many ways, and so there's not a lot of roads or electricity, and a lot of basic government services are often faltering there. However, what that has allowed to do is it has allowed these spaces to retain much of their cultural integrity over the many millennia that China has tried to kind of tie it all down under one Chinese identity. And so I remember living in this village. There was these three young men that were really kind of working with an NGO based out of the capital city of Kunming, and they were trying to do, I would say, high value crop production, right? So they were experimenting with coffee and rosemary and pine and all kinds of very interesting, I would say, planting ideas, right? And they were also, trying to, I would say, in some ways, perform a certain kind of environmentalism in order to get foreign volunteers to work there, which is how I found them, but also to kind of engage with people. Honestly, it has always been the case that I've seen this in the Himalaya as well, that the Himalaya often can feel like an island, right? Because it can get so isolated, and communities can get so marooned, right? And so I remember living with these hog farmers. They were farming pigs, and they also were doing that. Those three young men who were trying to do pine, coffee, and rosemary thing. And then one night I got invited to this. I had no idea, because in Yunnan they speak 130 different languages, and so even if you spoke Mandarin, which I did a little bit, I couldn't really understand what the people were talking about. And so it was literally kind of like it was a weird ritual. We went into this person's house, which the house itself was built into a rock, right? It seemed like this guy had carved a house into the mountain, and there were massive trees and huge moths were flying around, and there was a bonfire, and we sat by this fire, and this old man, he must have been in his 80s, and his friends, and there were like gorgeous drawings everywhere that looked like frescoes on the walls, and I was trying to understand, like, this farmer who spent all his days chasing his hogs around, had found time to make such incredible art, and then he was making his own alcohol at home. And then what he served us was, insects that burrow inside bamboo. Those these white maggots, like a barbecue over an open flame. And the whole setting, right, in many ways, kind of made me feel that each person, right, each of these people, including me, we were performing many different subjectivities depending on the space that we were in, right? And it was so reductionist of me and of anybody else to kind of try to pin down a person or a place, or let's say a forest or a piece of land, under the idea of one definition. That could be a productive definition, like calling something a forest versus a grassland. It could be a kind of a definition based on your livelihood choices, calling someone a herder versus a farmer, like a painter versus like a livestocker. And so for me, what was like being in Yunnan, and also I've seen a lot of this in Uttarakhand, this incredible sort of diversity of worlds that exist within even a tiny little community is often completely hidden from view, right? Because often, because of the way that the world is, that we pick on a couple of the dominant narratives that are emerging from out of a space, and then that kind of becomes the master narrative of that place. And I feel I had come from studying years of biology and physics and science and all that, where a search for this master narrative was seen as being kind of the central drive of science itself, right? Like finding ideas that could transcend scale and time. And I feel one of the biggest sort of shattering moments and one of the biggest re-educations I had through experiences like the one I just explained to you is the idea that these situated, embedded, emergent relationships, right, are so ununiversal, right, in many ways. They are so incredibly tied to a certain moment in space and time, so incredibly tied to the positionality, the intersectionality of the human being, of the community, of the non-human subject performing those things, right? And so, I mean, that is like one big thing which I feel has happened. That it did happen to me and is still happening. And I would say another big one was sort of thinking about life and death, right? Like about mortality, right? And I've seen so many people, like known so many people die in the mountains over these many years that I worked there, and through things like leopards eating them or them falling off a icy road and things like that, and then sort of kind of like understanding the stories and the myths and in many ways the differential precarities, right, that come with being a part of communities that are often at the receiving end of development project or colonial ideas of nature, and sort of seeing that despite death, despite these ideas of death and life that are maybe sort of orchestrated in some of our very mono class and mono, I would say, ideology spaces. These people completely challenge that in every way, right? Like, what do you do when someone dies? How do you go on? What do you do when someone is born? What do you do with a forest that is burning in front of your eyes, and you know that if this forest burns down, that's it for you. And so these questions, much deeper questions of justice and of sustainability, true sustainability, right? This idea of creating well-being, right? Not just for yourself, but for the whole world, and in a manner that sort of celebrates justice and equality. Some of these things, came out of, I would say, my experiences with, watching these communities deal with life and death, in many of these again, locations in these landscapes. And I would say, to kind of wrap up that, much of how these communities react to the way the world is tied to their relationships with that land, with that, the histories that are real for them, that are material, that flow through them like rivers. And so, in many ways, I feel environmentalism as a field needs to die in some ways and be reborn, using epistemologies of the South, using cosmologies of the pluriverse, using ideas that are coming out of people whose relationships with, let's say, the non-human world are not the one that are being celebrated or that are being operationalized to deal with the issues that you started this interview with.
I think that's amazing. And also, what is really interesting to me is that when we look into the very pre-colonial, structures of nature, obviously at different spatio-temporal moments of existence, we see how they were, nature, religion, existence, science, all they were entangled with each other. There were no such kind of hierarchies. But what we see from the colonial to the post-colonial periods, that they are all disconnected and segregated into separate boxes, and then the binaries and the hierarchies are being generated, as you were sharing through varieties of examples. I wish this conversation could continue, but unfortunately we have to stop here. Thank you once again, Ritodhi, for elaborately reflecting on the various challenges, environmental challenges, why conservation or conservationist or conservationism is a problematic ideology, and why we should counter it, how it is coming from how it is just an extension of the colonial scientific ideologies, how to counter it, and how the community should be put forward instead of training or teaching the community. How we should learn from the various communities who are associated with the nature and try to learn the basic purpose, the basic aspects of protecting and taking care of nature to create a more stable, a more sensible future for all of us. Thank you so much, Ritodhi, for your elaborate reflections.
Thank you, Sharon. No, I really appreciate this initiative of yours, and I hope it succeeds in all the best ways.
Thank you so much.